Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience while we allowed people to join. My name is Anna Bax from Internal Communications at Straive, and I'd like to welcome all of you to our Roundtable conference, Data, the Driving Force Behind Successful Publishing Strategies. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. All through the panel discussion, captions will be provided. So if you'll be watching our words, please feel free to use that option. There will be two brief polls at the start and at the end of the conference. We strongly encourage participants to take the time to provide responses to the polls. We also encourage you to use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the discussion. We will be monitoring your questions and will try to include at least one question at the end of each section. The remaining questions will be addressed during the formal Q&A session at the end of the conference. Now, I'd like to reassure everyone that we will respond to all of your questions. If we don't get to your question during this conference, we'll respond via email after. Finally, we'll be providing materials on the webinar when we're done. For your future use, please watch your email notifications for when those materials are available. We will now start by meeting our speakers. We are joined by three great speakers today. Murugesh Mayandi, the Chief Growth Officer at Straive, will be the moderator. He is joined by Kanwar Singh, SVP Data Platform for Operations at Elsevier, and Dan Pollock, Chief Digital Officer at Delta Think, and founder and principal consultant at Silicon Guru Limited. With this, I want to wish all of you a very good interactive session ahead. Over to you, Murugesh.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick round of introduction to get some more details on the panelists, and I'll start with myself. My name is Murugesh Mayandi. I'm right now in Singapore, usually living in Atlanta, Georgia, in the East Coast. I lead the data solutions business at Straive, as well as the growth officer at Straive. And my experience is about, and why am I here from data perspective? Love data, and over the last 2 decades have played various roles in terms of building data platforms, solutions, and helping organizations monetize data. And today, I'm going to lead this conversation with Kanwar and Dan about how data is playing a significant and an important role in the publishing strategy. Over to you, Kanwar, if you'll take a few minutes to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Murugesh, and thank you, Anna. Hello, everyone. Good to be here. My name is Kanwar Singh. I'm part of Elsevier. I manage data operations function for them. With the organization for around 12 years now, and I work very closely with Straive in many of our data strategies. So I'm glad to be here and look forward to a very interactive panel discussion.
Thank you, Kanwar. Dan, over to you. If you'll introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Dan Pollock. So I'm an industry analyst, management consultant. My current role involves looking at the scholarly publishing industry with a particular lens of using data wherever possible. So, for example, I'm part of a big project that gathers a lot of information, measuring the changing output and balance in our industry between different business models. And then very briefly, my background is as a digital publishing specialist. Back in the day, I'm an ex-product guy, ex-engineer before that, and have had stints at various publishers, including Elsevier back in the day. So very pleased to be on this session. Very excited to see what kind of conversation we're going to have.
Wonderful. Thank you both for joining me, and look forward to the conversation. Just setting the context, and I was just looking at some preparatory notes my team had shared, as well as doing some research. And when I was thinking about my own experience of what did I do 20 years back, 20 years back, and look at the journey of how the data itself has changed, the need for data is changing. And I go back to my first role, I was building reports, and then We looked at how do we store data, and then came the era of big data, where we said all data needs to be stored and all data needs to be used. And that's where the value is. And then we said, it's not about data, it's about how we create value from data and how do we monetize the data. And now we are in the era of what is the right data and how do we use the right data for making right decisions and automations and AI and everything. So our use and the need for data itself has been changing. And when I am trying to apply that to the publishing industry, which is primarily dependent on content as the prime source of products, decisions, engagements, and everything that the publishing industry is dependent on, there is a huge amount of need for leveraging data and the power of data to connect with the customers, to understand the experiences, to create efficient operational processes, to be compliant with regulations, all of these things. And bringing all of these are critical from a publishing industry and segment perspective, and which will help us get to creating better content, creating better customer experiences, and creating or playing a significant or an important role in the knowledge that is being created and shared. While we talk about these needs, there are still challenges in terms of siloed data processes, data stores, gaps in what data is collected, stored, and managed. How do we control and govern the data itself? And how do we finally use all of this data? And that's what we're going to talk about. What does Kanwar and Dan see from their shoes? What's happening in terms of the maturity of data and need for data, and how organizations are building data strategies to leverage the power of data. Now, before we get into the questions, I want to start with a very quick poll question. So Ritesh, if you can bring up the first poll question, please. I request everyone to take some time to share your perspective of where you stand with respect to this question. We'll take 30 seconds to answer, collect the responses, and look at the feedback as well. Okay, 10 more seconds. Okay, Ritesh, if you'll share the results, please. Okay, that's a very good response, very positive response, that most of you said data plays a key role, but we balance it with judgment. And I think if we just draw a graph there that shows the maturity trending in the right direction, and there's still lots to be done. We want to be in the first state, but again, as the response itself says, it needs to be balanced with the right decisions. With that, let's jump into the first question. Kanwar, I'll start with you. While the topic of the discussion is driving data being the driving force, there are still organizations, and how organizations use this data is driven by what is required from a reporting and metrics management perspective for operational needs or for some key elements within the organization. And it differs based on the level of maturity of the organization. Where do you see, in your experience, Kanwar, most of the organizations are in terms of leveraging data, and what should be done to move up the ladder in terms of how we use the data?
It's a great question, Murugesh, and I think the foundation of this question or the current situation is over the years, this industry has started gearing it itself to provide more insights to customers, more options to customers. And companies like ours, where we have a wealth of content and data points, they create new insights. And that's, to me, is the starting point here, that what is the lens through which we are looking at a customer problem, and how do we surface that customer problem, and what tools can help us in not only solving based on historical data, but also using data to create a better prognosis, better predictability, and merging data points across multiple domains that help them in creating a more holistic view. Doing a little more specific reflection on this is, as a traditional publisher into journals and books, that's the long history of Elsevier. But over the last 15, 20 years, the transition that we started doing into electronic and then into digital has created much more customer engagement. And based on these data points, if it is our health markets or if it is our education market, we started using these data points to say, how can we help our readers to become better nurses, our researchers to create more high quality collaboration for their research work. So generating those data points, either for an adaptive learning or developing new solutions where we can help create a better link between these customer segments. So it's a very essential part of our strategy, that how we leverage. But at the forefront, we always try to say, what is the customer problem we are trying to solve here? How can we make our customers' lives better, easier, generate more confidence for them to take high value decisions they want to take in their day-to-day life with a bit more ease. It's data always help them in augmenting. So that would be a little longer answer for the kickoff question that you shared.
I think that's a good starting point, at least. And digital transformation, moving into the digital era, looking at helping customers. And I think that should be fundamental to every organization, looking at it from a customer's point of view, and not just looking historically. That was also a very interesting point of view, but looking into the future and what do we have to create. All three are great points, Kanwar. Dan, let me ask you the same question and see what additional points you have in terms of how organizations need to take a holistic view, or what are you doing?
Mm-hmm. So for the purposes of discussion, I thought Kanwar's notion of moving from print to electronic to digital is quite an interesting starting point, because certainly something I've observed over the last 10, 15 years is there is a difference between simply taking print and print processes and making them electronic, and coming up with truly digitally native processes. And I'm alighting on that, I think, for two reasons. Number one, a facsimile of print, however electronic, is not really going to get you good data. I mean, having people hand type data into structured versions of print documents, if you then actually have to make use of that data, you'll find you're into an absolute data cleanup nightmare. So there's an issue of digitization, and I think, if I'm really honest, the scholarly publishing industry is still lagging in that. It was very quick to make things electronic, but I think there's still a lot of investment and catching up of processes to really fully push the sort of the digital side back up into the workflow. And then that gets me onto the second point, which is, of course, every single organization will say, gee, we are wonderfully customer focused. Yes, I absolutely agree, you should be. However, in order for that customer focus to surface, you do need to think about how you build things. And I think getting back to the questions about how organizations' data strategy has evolved over time, yes, some organizations that are producing customer-facing data feeds will of course look to those customers and produce data-driven products. But a lot of what our industry does in actual fact is a production process. And I think a lot of data strategies within our industry, within our bit of publishing, but also in other sorts of publishing and in other industries, and I've got experience from a number of different industries over the years, a lot of this work has got to be internally focused. Can we move away from silos of data? Can we actually have the production systems speak to the editorial systems, or the sales systems speak to the production systems and the finance systems? Because all of these systems grew up historically to solve very different problems. But I think what we find as time goes on, as data becomes more prevalent, as systems become more easily available, is that increasingly organizations' leadership wants to join the dots. And that then poses questions again back into the process, how we generate our internal facing data and make it fit for purpose to come out with joined up strategic decision making. And that's, again, usually you speak to any data scientist, they'll say 90% of their work is cleaning the stuff up and 10% of it is doing the actual data science. So I think I'm really speaking to that as a headline.
Wonderful. I think reiterating the move towards digital and what is required from being a digital native organization, and so how the focus shifts from being internal to customer facing are all going to push us to being a bit more holistic, but more strategic in how we look at building data platforms, solutions, and creating the path for what is required. Very well said, both of you. Now, from a research industry perspective, if you look at it, the users or the consumers, as well as the products, are so intertwined, from authors, reviewers, readers, and any sort of consumer of the data products itself. But at the same time, not all of this data is so well connected to really monetize and leverage the power of this data. That's our observation. That's maybe a little touchy subject, but that's our observation in terms of, while organizations want to leverage the power of data, it is still not available in a way that the power can be fully leveraged. Do you see this? And while you spoke about looking at a customer facing and driven by the customer needs, how are you really solving for these data silos? Any examples? Dan, I'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, so we're talking about data. Which data? Data about what is my first question, because if you think about the research process in particular, think about what a researcher does. I'm going to pick a researcher in a lab, so apologies to people in the humanities and social sciences, but labs tend to generate more data by volume and serve as an easier example for me. So if you look at people generating information in the lab, their data needs will be very focused on their experimentation and their research. And that is being generated well ahead of them ever interfacing or interacting with a publisher. It's really not until they come to submit their research that they will then start to have those conversations with a publisher. And quite often at that point, and we've come across research, I'm thinking, for example, Digital Sciences annual report about the state of open data has some very interesting data on this. Through surveys of researchers. Quite often researchers don't even think about some of the policies they've got to enact and how they might tidy things up until it comes to the point of publication. And then it may be down to the publisher to remind them that there's bits of tidying up to be done before they can even finish off their the write-up of their paper. So we've now got different customer segments. Are we talking, for example, researchers in the process of research? Or are we talking researchers in the process of authors submitting publications? And then, of course, as you move through publication and post-publication, there's the outputs of that, the metadata of the publications, and then the linking of the narrative text in a journal paper back to the data sets that are really supporting the assertions in that paper. And I think that's going to be another area of endeavor. Fundamentally, a research paper is no longer just a matter of assertions and references. You've got to have data which has been pulled from deep inside the research process in order to inform that. And you may even find that references and things like that in your research paper will need to be able to reach back into data repositories. So we're finding a world now that's becoming very interconnected across a number of different use cases. So I think it's quite hard to answer that question. There's not one size fits all. It depends which bit of the process you're looking at data about, and what your products are going to be doing to help that part of the process. That will really give you the lens through which you can spot your customer needs and therefore what you might do with data.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's coming back to what are your priorities and what are your customer needs, and start with that and try to connect the dots and building use cases. That's a good way to look at it, Dan. Thank you. Kanwar, any additional or a different view?
I think Dan did cover a very critical aspect from the customer segment perspective. I like to a little bit build on top of this. Having data and multiple sources of data and multiple quality thresholds of data is also a great problem to have. But going deeper into a customer segment and the persona we are looking for, there could be a very specific solution that can be carved out. We don't have to boil the ocean. What I'm highlighting here is that for a research leader, his outcome based on the research input and the knowledge stack that comes with the research article could be a bit different compared to a librarian persona segment who wants to look more from a coverage perspective. So I think getting to that customer specificity will help in managing the maze of the size of the problem. Otherwise, it becomes, we don't want to become a Google of research itself, because that will be not the specific answer where our customer segments want a specific answer for their day-to-day problems. I come to my job, I have to hire someone as a research assistant, or I have to fund a particular project, or I have to take an analysis of this thing. These require different attributes of various, as an author, editor, researcher, reviewer combination. How do I select a specific content which goes into that journal publication? All require a different lens. And I think getting to that specific use case to me is the driving force here. The risk is companies can get over ambitious in areas. We as individuals tend to say a golden problem to solve, but the solution is in the specificity. What is the data point that is required by that customer segment? So I'm just building on, Dan, you touched that point of customer segment. And today we can look at one article as more than 2,000 data points in this. And if we are curating all those 2,000 data points, we may not be able to solve all customer problems. But if we say this specific customer problem, then we can be more fruitful in coming to a right outcome.
Yeah, and Kanwar, I really like your notion of but what questions are people trying to answer that follows from the customer segment and drives the data that they might need to answer them. So
absolutely,
absolutely.
I like that.
Use case, I think approach is essential.
I personally love the don't boil the ocean aspect, right? Let's start, build iteratively, find value, and then continue to build upon, rather than just trying to define everything and solve for everything. That's a very good point. Thank you. Now, the next question, and we'll go into a quick poll after this. The next question is something that I am very passionate about. I'm trying to learn as well as apply this. The question is about alternative data. It is about data that you don't have today, and you are getting signals and other sources of data to really create new value from whatever data that is existing within the organization. And in other industries, financial services especially, this is a huge demand and a stream that I see from a perspective of new data needs, being able to create alternative data sources for decision making. How is this in the publishing industry? I want to hear your experiences. Do you see this in play already? Do you see this in the future? Are there any specific or interesting use cases that you've seen where you say we had to tap into this sort of an alternative data to really bring value to our customers and products? Dan, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll leap off. So I want to narrow this again. You know, we in the spirit of not trying to boil the ocean, and look very particularly at the scholarly publishing industry and how it is being measured, because I think there's some interesting use cases there. And the simple point I want to make is I think the trend I've seen emerging over the last 3 to 4 years is there is a number of quite important data sources either emerging or cohering, emerging as being important, that are not coming from publishers. They're not coming from the industry. So I'm thinking of things such as the Directive of Open Access Journals, which has been around for quite a number of years. And that the focus of that is to round up a definitive or curated list of journals that published exclusively using the open access model. And the interesting thing there was that the DOAJ, the Directive of Open Access Journals, was nominated by Coalition S as being an index that journals had to be in order to qualify. So briefly, Coalition S, this is the European Commission directive that European funded research should be published in fully open journals. What's a fully open journal? Got to be listed in the Directive of Open Access Journals. So we now see a situation where what was a sort of almost standalone not-for-profit trying to assess the changing landscape has now actually become quite an important metric in that landscape. And another example I put forward is our research, who most people probably know via their unpaywall data set and browser extension. And they've tried to answer the question of where can a reader find a legitimate free-to-read copy of a journal article. And they do that by scouring repositories on the web and trying to direct people to if you like, the best version. And they started life with a browser plugin, but they've now launched other products based on that data set. And again, I think they're interesting because they are a not-for-profit. They've come from outside the publishing industry, and yet they are generating metadata that the publishing industry itself is now using. So all of the major indexes, Clarivate's Web of Science, Elsevier's Scopus, Digital Sciences Dimensions, a bunch of others are now using the unpaywall data set to decide if particular papers fall under particular open access models. That's not something that's come out of the publishing industry. So I highlight those just as two interesting examples of how data and the rise of digital and digitally native organizations is beginning to democratize or break apart what might have been considered traditionally the publisher's exclusive domain. And they're now indeed beginning to feed into it and feed organizations both on the publisher side and also the publisher's customers in terms of making their decisions and making their buying or selling decisions.
Wonderful.
Be careful what you wish for with those examples.
No, I love the publishing customer use case where you're using this data from their consumption perspective to really drive what needs to be created. Beautiful. Yeah. Kanwar, any interesting use case from your experience?
I think I would like to highlight that there is a business model part of this discussion. How do we look at new alternative source? How and business model would tend towards NGOs, our revenue sharing, our monetization around it. Which probably I think we can park it from this panel discussion, and there could be different point of views there. But in terms of alternative data sources, I think to solve a customer problem that's emerging as a very trending area. I mean, there are a couple of use cases that come into my highlight now. One is that over the last 2-3 years, I would say, let's say a benefit or something, a silver lining of COVID was that it asked companies like ours and our partners and pharmaceutical and others to come together and share their data and make these alternative data available. So we participated in a large world scale program where companies like ours, pharma companies, created a COVID database which correlated with the latest research, the clinical trials, the phases of the pandemic, which helped a number of companies, number of individuals all over the world to come to a very agile way of addressing various challenges. And won't go into those specific, but it would have not been possible if we were sitting in our own space and trying to solve that larger business problem. So some instances like this is initiated by economic or a world situation, macroeconomic situation. But in some other areas, this is now creating more handshakes between companies to say, We have, let's say, a medical equipment information, how it performs under various medical scenarios. We have health analytics data. Is there a threshold to merge which can help clinicians take better optimized usage of the medical equipment, their life cycle, along with clinical diagnosis? And those becomes again very specific use cases, sitting in very alternative, external to a publishing source. And there are a number of other examples, depending upon even within publishing or within the research space, if I say not publishing, but the research space, there are still a number of data sources which we can harness to solve business problems. I think building that business model will be a parallel discussion. Finding a solution, there's absolutely a good threshold for collaboration now in the data space.
Well, I like your point about alternative data is not just for one individual organization, but how it is promoting collaboration and how it helped during the COVID time was a new dimension that I've not seen Convert. Thank you for sharing that. With that, let's go to the next poll question and get some more engagement from our audience. If you'll take a few seconds to share your thoughts on what is your biggest challenge with data. We'll take 30 seconds. This is an interesting question, and in all, I'll say 5 answers are going to lead into different questions, but let's see what comes back. And there are some questions also coming up in the chat window. Looks like we'll go into a few more questions and then we'll open up for questions. But let's close the poll now, and Ritesh, if you'll share the responses. All right, noise in the data. I love it when people say data quality is a problem, because that's true. And that's the fundamental thing that we all have to solve for. Lack of IT systems for integrating and processing data stands second. Privacy and security concern is at least in this group, not much of a concern. So let's start with noise in data that needs cleanup. And I'm sure, Conver, there's no question about you agree or not, but I think one of the biggest things that I see why there is noise, and I'd love a challenge as well, is because there's just the variety of the data in the publishing industry is just so unmanageable to some extent, right? And also added to that is lack of standards or not able to apply common standards, I'll say. So now 2 things. Number 1, the variety, and number 2 is cannot just standardize it, right? And you lose the value of the data itself. Now, how do you solve it in your organization, and how do you prioritize what gets solved for and can derive value out of it?
It's a loaded question. I think Dan mentioned in the start, 90% of the time data scientists talk about cleanse the data. I think, Dan, you said 10% time they work on the data. I think 10% time they also talk about the problem that they were cleaning it up.
Don't trust that statistic. It's more an anecdotal one, but yeah, the vast majority.
No, the vast majority. And I'm just echoing what you're saying, because that's the problem. It is a problem that there is non-standardization and there is various ways of working. But let's put a researcher hat and say it from their perspective. What is their main job? Their main job is to do good research and make that research available. And I think it becomes some kind of our problem now to say, was it a good research or not, and how it was written could be 2 different aspects of this. So I think we have to decouple the problem and say, how do we make that research more easily discoverable, easily connectable? And that's where I think data science and the whole partnership ecosystem that companies like ours have built in is helping us. It is also a bit of a challenge for us to scale at many times. But then the trade-off question is, what is our quality threshold? What brand and quality we want to go to customers with, and what is acceptable and not acceptable from a customer point of view. So there is no one fixed answer for this. Health sciences, specific areas, there is no room for any error that we can propagate. So automation cannot be the driving force, and we do need eyeballs and human augmentation to ensure the noise, so-called, is eliminated. Good gold standards are eventually developed that helps us in generating confidence in that space. So I'm thinking loud here, that sharing loudly here, that this problem is not going to go away. And we probably need to wear different lenses to say what outcomes we do need to achieve and how do we optimize for that specific outcome. We don't need a 2000 horsepower workforce for each use case. For some use cases, classification are those areas we have some more leverage, but in some specific drug dosage and some other areas where it need to be highly specific and accurate. So how do we do a right play depending upon which customer segment, what business problem we are trying to solve? So that's the area I see we'll continue to invest in, going more from looking just at the data point, that the data doesn't live in isolation, it lives in a ecosystem. How does it link with the entities in which that ecosystem exists, and generating maybe a next instance that helps our readers to take, our consumers of data to take better informative decisions from just a data point, but to create a more entity linked relationship and say, is that deduped? Is that accurate? Is it complete? All the data quality dimensions adding on top of it. Yeah, I'll probably park there, Murugesh. This question can take over the.
Yeah, I know it's a
full
very
panel.
loaded question, as you said. But this is not necessarily a question, but maybe if I'm sitting with you and having a drink, I'll ask the saying, as an industry, do you think we have the right amount of investments in quality, in data quality, or do you think it needs to go up? And it includes both automation as well as human investments. Just a quick pulse check. What's your thought?
I think this is an area where requires a fresh look, because sometimes our definition of data quality has been more consumed in the structure, in the way the data is displayed, but not in the correctness or accuracy of the data. So it definitely needs a refresh. There are some use cases where obviously the reading behavior has to be fully met, but from a data uniqueness perspective, its accuracy perspective, its timeliness perspective, it needs to be refreshed in the way we are working. I also add another dimension here, what we call ocean and waves. As new data is created, it creates a wave, but then we have this ocean where all the corpus of the data exists. And that relationship of that corpus with the new data that is created creates new insights. And that cannot be a static business. If we are in the business of data, everything is connected, then we have to refresh our approach. And so a couple of these dimensions, I think, are definitely an area for us to reflect back in saying, how do we look from data holistically and not just the process data or a representation layer of that data.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kanwar. Very valid points. And we got to the refresh in terms of our approaches, very timely and very critical. Dan, any thoughts from your side in terms of data quality, noise in the data, lack of standardization, and how are you doing it in your clients, in your organization, as well as how are you advising your friends and other organizations?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work with data, so yes, loads of thoughts. I take the economic question as a jumping off point. I'm not sure we necessarily need to invest more in it, but I think building on what Kanwar said, I'd suggest that refresh needs to be, we need better enforcement. We need much better buy-in and cooperation to make sure we have meaningful standards. The old joke about standards is, the beauty about standards is there are so many to choose from, but in some aspects of scholarly publishing, I think we just haven't really enforced them at all. So, for example, if we want to measure what licenses articles are published under. Now, that's a pretty fundamental question. If you're a publisher, we do not have an industry standard way of doing it. Back to my example of on Paywall, for example, who are using essentially machine AI sorts of techniques, natural language processing, to try and infer that information absent any centralized data standard for it. Or Crossref. I mean, Crossref is a good cross-industry initiative that allows people to mint DOIs, so persistent identifiers of content or chunks of content. Great, but we've never really fully exploited that. So, for example, you can classify your content as being top of my mind at a conference proceeding or report or journal article. And within journal article, you can have everything from a peer-reviewed scholarly article, the sort of thing we really think is the bread and butter of our industry, right the way through to anything that might sort of be article-like in a printed magazine. That could be a retraction, it could be a letter, it could be a short-form comment piece. So although there's lots of data there, there's simply not the resolution within it for us to extract meaning from it. Or another example is we have yet to fully decide how we attribute researchers' roles. So you're one of a number of authors that are listed on a paper, but there's no indication of, were you the person doing the data, or was somebody else the person operating the centrifuge, and who was doing the writing up? They might all be very different roles and skill sets, but at the moment, we have absolutely no way of unpicking that because we're not capturing that. So I think that the basic infrastructure and technologies there, it is really now a matter of the will of the industry to come together and start measuring things more consistently. And I think that in turn is going to be driven essentially by whoever's got the checkbook, which is why I find it interesting. The sort of the recent mandates, for example, the OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy mandate about making US federally funded research public access, has within it specifications about data, about basic data hygiene, persistent identifiers. I find it interesting that in 2022, it is necessary even to make that a thing. Clearly, I think back to one of my earlier points, we've got a bit of catching up to do in terms of the basic plumbing and just basic data hygiene. So it's about actually enforcement and just a sort of collective adoption of those standards. I think once we crack that, it will then make a lot of the downstream processes easier, cleaner. It will make it, I think, easier for our readers to extract insights from what we're doing. It will make it easier for us as industry operatives to measure and compare what we do. And I compare and contrast, for example, if you look at the recording industry, you can go out from the Recording Industry Association of America, for example, and within 2 or 3 months of each calendar year end, you'll get very up-to-date statistics on both volume and value of sales by different recording formats. And you can go back and you can see the rise of CDs and the influence of Napster and the collapse of the industry. All of that's made possible because that particular industry is prepared to share information and adopt standards in a way that perhaps the scholarly publishing industry has yet to fully adopt. We do some of it, but as I said, I think to Kanwar's point, it needs a refresh, it needs an update, it needs greater commitment, and then that in turn will mean there's probably a bit less, maybe a lot less noise that we need to clean up before we can extract meaning.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. And I'll end this with one last a little lighter question, because I've been asking too many loaded questions, looks like. But in the interest of sharing your knowledge and how you build your own capabilities, right? As leaders, what is important, I think, is we got to keep ourselves up to date on what is happening and how are we able to think beyond what today's and current needs are. So how do you keep yourself updated with what is happening in the data? And I will actually expand it to the data analytics and the AI space. And what sources do you tap into to keep yourself up to date and that you think will be meaningful and helpful for this audience as well? Dan, I'll start with you. What do you do to keep yourself up to date?
I think 2 or 3 things. Number one, you need to read and look out for the relevant bits of news in our industry. There's a number of different sources. I think attending forward-looking conferences, so something like Context, CONTCH, that's a focus on where technology and content meet. And then the other thing I always recommend to people is look outside your own ivory tower, look to other industries, look at what they're doing. I found particularly in my career when I've been making business cases for new products, new digital products, I'd often reach for adjacencies to help make a case. Of course, you may get pushback from people saying, well, is that applicable to us? Are we quite here yet? But of course, that's the point. If you want to try and spot what might happen next, where things might go, looking for those adjacencies, I think can be very useful. I can't point you to a magic source. It's just a case of sort of, reading and finding the people in your network that might be able to tip you off and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, good sources, news, conferences, adjacent industries, people. Kanwar, what would you add to that from your list of things?
Yeah, I think I follow what Dan, you are highlighting. My personal point of view is this industry is moving in dog years, right? So every year is 7-8 years fast for us, and thinking that I can be on pace with everything happening, I'll probably fool myself. Obviously, I fully recognize we need to read, we need to embrace, but I do think building cross-skilled teams and ensuring people of different skills and competencies come together and add their point of view, their expertise to a common business problem helps to take a few steps together forward. Subject matter expertise, domain specialization, years of operational experience, technical skills, even core plumbing, software engineering skills, product management, and especially data product management. So getting people with different skills and they trying to look at the similar problem with different lenses helps in surfacing a lot of demystifying some of the technologies, the buzzwords into tangible next steps, to be more blunt, that we can take. And then I think it's all about iterative learning. How quick are we able to fail or learn from some mistakes and adapt ourselves into the next stage itself. It's no magic bullet, I believe, Murugesh, and the depending on the size and complexity, these teams could be small or large. What we can bring critically together.
I think the magic bullet is what you all spoke about. There is no magic bullet, and we have to iteratively learn. There is one source that I will add that I'm seeing a lot of information that is coming from is startups and research organizations. And I say research organizations including universities that are testing some of these hypotheses in a much rapid manner. And there are some failures lead to more lessons, and how we are able to take and apply those learnings is going to be helping all of us as well. Wonderful conversation. I enjoyed this thoroughly. Some of the key things that I took away from this, and I hope the audience also recognize and will take this as feedback. As the first thing that I think no-brainer is think from a customer perspective and build your data strategies from what is required from your end consumer perspective. We are in a digital era, and being digital native and data native is very critical. But at the same time, as Kanwar said, don't boil the ocean. Take a very iterative approach in building what is required for you. Alternative data is picking up steam, and I'm very happy to hear the use cases that you both mentioned. And I'm looking for more and more use cases and how alternative data is going to push this industry forward. While we are doing all of this, some of the fundamental problems, whether it's data qualities, building pipelines, creating the right strategies, all of these are critical. We got to keep our eye on this and make sure we are building an organization that's sustainable, but that's learning fast on our daily mistakes as well as successes, and building what is required for the future. Thank you, Kanwar and Dan, but hold on, let's see what questions we have from the panel. Before, Ritesh, are there any questions before we go to the exit poll?
Yes, Murugesh, we do have some questions.
Will you please open them up or will you put them up?
Yeah. So there is one question with so many facets of data. How do organizations prioritize?
How do organizations prioritize what is required from a data perspective? I think we covered this in some of our questions, looking at it from a customer perspective, looking at it from your use case perspective. But Dan or Kanwar, if you want to add anything more, anything in detail.
I think there's absolutely, there's the customer-driven side of things, and then internally it's going to be down to what questions do the leadership team ultimately want to answer, or does the leadership or product teams or any team in the organization, what questions are you trying to answer to solve your particular problems? I always think that should be used to then drive which data you need, gather that consensus across an organization, and you'll be able to draw up a priority list, usually based on how much it's worth, let's be honest.
Yeah. What's the business case?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anything else, Ritesh, from a question perspective?
Yeah, we have another question is coming from John. What type of new tools do you have or envision you will need to sustain data product development?
Okay, this is something that we did not cover. Kanwar, you want to give your thoughts? What tools are you looking at or are you envisioning in your years?
I think tool is a question we normally leave to our working group, the squads that are developing the data products, that what is their best mechanism. Obviously, there is a company policy. There are some guidelines that helps us to say from a security, from a licensing, from standardization perspective that drive these decisions. And based on this, to my best understanding, there are few stacks of tool, ranging from Databricks for analysis, Snowflake, and other from a visualization perspective. But then there's a lot of flexibility given to the teams to pick how they want to develop their business models or algorithms. Obviously, it goes through a security and a compliance part of our organization before it is onboarded. So it's a larger stack and goes depending upon what business needs we are solving.
Got it. Thanks, Kanwar.
I
think
there's another question for Kanwar only. In your product development strategies, how is your value add driving revenues?
That's a good question. So the value add is driven by what customer problem we are trying to solve here. And we try to wear that hat the maximum. And to solve that customer problem, what set of capabilities and what kind of data that we are providing to solve the customer problem. So we try to triangulate between customer problem value, the data value, and the capability, ease of use in which we can run this thing. And then it is a prioritization stack, based on what opportunities we have, how do we prioritize various opportunities is the driving force. And it's a multi-portfolio company, so different customer segments, market segments exist. So, but these are generic factors that we consider in prioritizing our products.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kanwar and Dan. Enjoy the conversation. I think that brings us to the end of this conversation. Hope you enjoyed the discussion too. Look forward to another fruitful conversation sometime soon.
All right. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.